Welcome back everyone to another Mythfall Devlog. If you're new to the channel, I'm building a bullet hell realm-like MMO called Mythfall. If you want to try it, I'm constantly updating and re-releasing it to mythfall.com where you can play it directly in your browser. A year ago, I made a video going over what I did in the first year of development. Now it's the second year, so let's do this a second time. Presenting What I Did Last Year, Part 2, by Unit of Time. As you can tell from the side-by-side, the game has changed an enormous amount over the last year. The visuals changed a lot, but most importantly, there's a lot of new gameplay and tooling features that I worked on. This year I struggled a lot trying to nail down the exact gameplay loop that I wanted Mythfall to have. Originally I was trying to make a strict roguelike MMO, but those two concepts don't mesh well together. Roguelikes typically lack strong progression mechanics, whereas the major focus of a typical MMO is all about progression, acquiring gear, leveling up, etc. So I decided to cave and focus a bit more on the progression that I wanted Mythfall to have. After brainstorming and testing, I finally landed on the idea of having progressively difficult progression systems. Basically, I wanted to have a simple, easy to understand progression at the start, and then roll that progression into more complicated systems. So for example, Mythfall starts with an experience-based progression system. Then after reaching the level cap, which is currently 10, hopefully the player has discovered that they can craft better gear, leading them into the next progression, crafting. For the crafting progression, I currently have a basic material progression going from driftwood to obsidian. Then I'm hoping to expand that into a very Terraria-like crafting tree, where you start combining this sword and that sword to create a different sword. Obviously, some of this is still up in the air, but I'm happy to at least have settled on the concept of how I want my progression systems to be structured. So to facilitate the initial progression, I added XP drops from killing mobs and a super simple leveling and XP system. I also added crafting NPCs that you can interact with to craft new gear from old gear. For crafting recipes, I structured them by storing the output and the input items required to craft it. Then I generated a little UI that filters and explains all of this to the player. Because I have a crafting system now, I also needed a way for players to get material. So I decided to add a remote, easy action landmass, or realm for short. But basically it's a big island that has various biomes, each with their own monsters and drop tables. The monsters get progressively more difficult the further you travel into the island. And some drop dungeons with bosses, which each have their own special drop table. Adding the realm was challenging from a software perspective. Originally the game was designed to have a bunch of small dungeons, not one really big world. So I had to rewrite a few things so that Mythfall could support executing the AI loop for over 10,000 monsters. I also had to make a few changes in my tile map code to improve the auto-tiling rendering performance. Because the map was so big, I decided to use Aseprite as my map editor. I just load the 2048 by 2048 image and then draw what the map should look like. I have different colors for different tile types. Then when I want to generate the map in the game, I just read through all of the pixels of the PNG and build my map from that. In the future, I might add the ability to place entities by having a second layer with a second PNG and an entity per color. But for now, I load entities like trees, rocks, and other decorations by just randomly placing them around the island. I also decided to add asset hot reloading to my engine. Over time, I realized I was wasting a lot of time just recompiling my project. For example, let's say I'm making a new monster. If I wanted to change their attack pattern, I have to change it in code and then relaunch the game. For the config file format, I chose YAML, mostly because I'm familiar with it and it's relatively simple. It's also not that much of a commitment because I can add a new deserializer format to my asset loader and not worry about porting the old YAML files over until I need to. With an asset hot reloader, now I can run around and playtest my game. Then if I want to tweak anything, I can update the YAML file and watch the entity auto-magically update. When I initially coded Monster AI, I tried to come up with some general utility AI tree, where depending on what's happening to the monster, they'd select different behaviors or attacks. I eventually realized that this didn't support my customization needs, so I ended up switching over to a hierarchical finite state machine. I mostly just want to plan out monster encounters, so with finite state machines I can just describe what the mob should be doing in different phases. Then I can transition them from phase to phase based on conditions like time, health, or number of attacks. A few people have asked about my backend setup and my financials. Right now the entirety of the Mythfall game runs on a single server, but I do use a few external services as well. On the core game server, I run all of my Docker containers, a proxy, a game server, a Redis instance, and my monitoring tools, Prometheus and Grafana. For the main website hosting, I use Firebase. It mostly just hosts my static website assets. Then for larger assets like music, I store them on Cloudflare and dynamically load them after the game launches. This keeps the game binary small so that the website can load fast. For Firebase and Cloudflare, I fall well within the free tier. Then the only server I actually have to manage right now is a $6 host hash instance. I kind of treat this as both my test and prod server, but I'm likely going to create a separate test server. That way I can test new features on something that sort of resembles a production server, rather than just testing everything in production. Well, that's all I have for this week. As always, an absolutely massive thank you to all the supporters on YouTube, Twitch, GitHub, and Patreon. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.